Hello. Before we discuss this week's Parshat Va'eira, which contains the first seven of the 10 plagues, I would like to take a closer look at the characters of Paro and of Moshe. Because although we all know the historical relevance of the story of the Exodus and the plagues that are part and parcel of that, and we understand what that means in terms of how it helped to form our identity as a Jewish nation, I think that we can also glean so much if we look at the story also on a metaphorical level of who Paro was and who Moshe was and who we are supposed to be. And if you juxtapose both of those characters, you can understand the position that the Jewish people were in and the way that the plagues were meant to affect the Jewish nation and that were led from Moshe and the Egyptian nation under Paro. So let's start and take a look at Paro. Now, Paro is the epitome of ego. As we know, Paro he viewed himself as a god, which means there was no room for the true God. He was so full of ego that whatever it was that he decided, despite what logic or reality told him, he could not move past it, even if it meant the destruction of his country, even if it meant the destruction of his people, even if it meant the destruction of his own son or himself at the end, unfortunately. And this is what ego can do. It can make somebody self-destruct with the lack of ability to let truth and to let God in, the real God with a capital G. Then things can just get out of control, and like I said, he can cause his own demise. And then if you take a look at Moshe Rabbeinu, we know, represents, he was Anav Mikol Adam, the most modest person that ever existed. And the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest prophet that ever was and that ever will be was because he was the one who was the most Anav, the most modest person that ever lived. What does that mean? It's not a self-debasing thing. It's the fact that all that self-importance, all that bad ego that we have, he was devoid of that. And that's why he was able, with this empty vessel that wasn't filled with all that ego, to be able to have the clearest voice that represented God's will, the clearest vision of God, because it wasn't colored, it wasn't murked up by all of his own will, desire, ego. That is always what blurs us from understanding and seeing and knowing truth and God. And because he was the most modest, the most empty of that ego, he was able to fill up with the most of God from above, the highest level that a man could possibly see, understand, give over. And that's who he was. Now, the problem with the Jewish people being in exile is because they fell somewhere in between there. They knew in the deepest recesses of who they were, they had a faith, they knew there was the one true God. But they had been in Egypt so long under Paro that they started to fall into the traps that we all do as individuals. In the traps of nature, they lived in Egypt where the Nile was rich and the land was fertile. And when you live in that environment, when things are so good, as I know coming from America, a land of plenty where everything is abundant and amazing and wonderful, you can't help but fall into the trap that you just expect the food to be there. You just expect everything. It's so easy to forget God when you're in a scenario like that. And unfortunately, that's what happens. It's human nature, and it happened to the people in Egypt as well. And there was a lot of other things, idolatry and all sorts of things that they saw and that impacted them, that couldn't help but impact them, because it was such a powerful nation. They had, as we're told, they had these necromancers, they had these wise people, they had astrologers who can do all sorts of crazy, miraculous seeming things too. And so, the eye sees, the heart sometimes follows. And when the people had to be taken out of Egypt, the plagues that occurred, those 10 makot that occurred, were not just as some punitive form for the Egyptians. They were for everybody. They're for the Jewish nation as well, to see and to understand and to internalize the message on every level when it comes to land, when it comes to animal, when it comes to man himself, is that no matter how amazing things seem to be to go a certain way, in the end of the day, God pulls the strings. In the end of the day, it all came from God. God giveth, God can taketh away. And that we had to experience that on an experiential level, to knock the message in our heads and to bring out again that faith that we have that's there. But in order to do that, this is a problem, is that the Moshe and the Paro actually exists within all of us. We all have that intense ego at times. And when we have an ego, it pushes God out. It pushes truth out. We fall into traps of taking what we know to be true and hardening our own hearts and not accepting or not doing what we know is the right thing. We're capable of doing things that we know are wrong and that we know have failed us in the past, and yet we make the same mistakes again and again. So sometimes I hear people ask, how could Paro and all that, and we have to go into the free will. I mean, that's a big discussion of its own. But Paro in the beginning had choices to make, and he made his choices in the beginning. And we do that. We make our choices. Unfortunately, when we make bad choices over and over again, there's a saying, "B'derech shadam v'tzelalech molich moto," that the path that man wants to take, God helps him. He lets him go on that path. So if we want and desire and try to walk on the good path, we get assistance. But if we choose and want very deeply to do the wrong thing, unfortunately, it's easy to do that too. We have just as much ease and a right, and there's no difference. It's just you get to make that decision. And the way to make the right decision is not to be so full of self and to think from self of what fills your egoistic needs, but to try and look at the bigger picture, to try and empty the self and see what is right, what is good, what makes sense, and just let that voice of God fill you in and do the right thing. So I think that's the greater message. We all have some of Paro in us, and we all have the ability of Moshe Rabbeinu to empty that out and let the voice of God in. And I hope we can all just take the right path, and I wish you all a amazing, peaceful, warm, delicious Shabbat Shalom.